Hi boys and girls, Pablum FishPig here to read you another simple story. This one's called The Quarrel. Once there were two little girls who were sisters, and their names were Betty and Susan Groby. Betty was 11 and Susan was 10, and they generally got on very well together, but sometimes they quarreled. Their mother, Mrs. Groby, always said she wouldn't have them quarreling because there was no need for it, and she had never quarreled with her sister when they were little, and she would have been ashamed to. So when Betty and Susan did quarrel, they didn't let her know. Well, they had all their clothes the same, except that some of Betty's were a little bigger because she was a year and nearly 4 months older, and sometimes they put on something of the other ones by mistake. Well, that didn't matter, but Susan was more careless about it than Betty, and did it more often. So one day she put on Betty's stockings, and Betty didn't find out until Susan was quite dressed with her boots laced, because they went to school directly after breakfast, and they generally put on their boots when they dressed in the morning so as to have more time. And Susan was dressed before Betty, because Betty was always a little sleepy in the morning, and Susan had got up earlier. So when Betty was hurrying to put on her stockings and to put one on, she said, "Look here, you have got on my stockings, and it's too bad, because you must have known they are a size bigger than yours." Susan said, "Oh, bother, well, I can't change them now. I should have to take off my boots." Betty said, "Well, then, you had better take off your boots and be quick about it. You can wear my stockings, but I can't wear yours. They are too short." But Susan said she wouldn't, and it went on like that, with Betty saying she must, and her saying she wouldn't, till at last Betty said, "Well, I'm not going to wear your beastly stockings, and I shall get another pair out of the drawer and tell Mother I had to." Well, they weren't allowed to do that, so as to save on washing bills, and they weren't allowed to say beastly either, but they did sometimes. And Susan said, "All right, sneak to Mother. I'm going downstairs." So Betty was more angry than ever, but she and Susan never did tell tales of one another, and she didn't like to take another pair of stockings out of the drawer when it was only Monday, and they hadn't worn those ones more than a day. So she put on Susan's stockings, and they were very uncomfortable because they were too short. Well, they didn't say anything more about it until they got ready to go to school, and by that time Betty didn't want to change her stockings because she would have had to take off her boots too. But she was very angry and kept on at Susan, and Susan answered her back and was very rude, and they kept on all the time they were going to school. And at last Betty said, "I shan't speak to you again until you beg my pardon and say you're sorry." And Susan said, "I shan't beg your pardon, and I'm not sorry, and I shall do it again tomorrow." Well, when they came out of school, Betty had thought of something, and there was a friend of theirs called Christine Tong who generally walked home with them, and Betty said to Christine Tong, "You can talk to Susan Groby if you like, but I'm not going to, because she is a thief." And Christine Tong said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "She steals stockings." Susan was angry at that, and said to Christine Tong, "You can talk to Betty Groby if you like, but I'm not going to. She steals money." Of course, this wasn't true, and she only said it to be aggravating, and Betty said, "Oh, what a lie, I shall tell Mother." And Susan said, "She is a sneak, too, and I wish I hadn't got her for a sister." So they went on about it again until they got home, and when they were getting ready for dinner, Susan took off her boots and Betty's stockings, and said, "Here are your beastly stockings, and please hurry up and give me mine, because I am cold with nothing on my feet." And then Betty had to take off her boots too, which she didn't want to do, and she had got used to wearing Susan's stockings, and had only had to let out her suspenders a little. And she said, "Now I shan't ever speak to you again in my life, and when I'm grown up I shan't come to your wedding." And Susan said, "I wouldn't have you, and I shall tell my children that you are not their aunt, because I shan't own you." Well, that afternoon, Christine Tong told some of the others that Susan Groby had said that Betty Groby stole money, and they thought it was very dreadful, and they would speak to her, but she didn't know why. So she asked them, and they said, "Because you are a thief. Christine Tong said so." And it got to the ears of the mistress, whose name was Miss Bedell's, and she said, "What is this I hear, Betty Groby, that you have stolen some money?" And Betty said, "I haven't," and she burst out crying. So Miss Bedell said, "I must look into this," and she looked into it. And they said, "It is only fun." And she said, "Well, I don't like that sort of fun in my school, and don't let me have any more of it." Well, when they went home from school, Betty was still crying, though she tried not to. And Christine Tong was angry because she said she had told tales of her, and she said to Susan, "Oh, let us leave her and run on." So they ran on. But Susan was beginning to be rather ashamed of the quarrel, and she said to Christine Tong, "It was you who told tales. You knew I didn't mean it about Betty stealing money." And she said, "Well, did she mean it about you stealing stockings?" And she said, "Well, I did take her stockings, but it wasn't stealing." And Christine Tong said, "Yes, it was, and you are a thief, and she is a telltale, and I don't want to be friends with you any more." And Susan said, "I don't want to either. You smell." So when they went indoors, Betty was still crying, though she tried not to because she didn't want her mother to see. And Susan was beginning to be very sorry. She didn't say anything at first, but she went and got a painting book which a girl called Marjorie Bristow had swapped with her for a doll's petticoat, and she had only painted one picture in it. And she took it to Betty and said, "I'll give you this for your own. Don't cry any more." But Betty said, "I don't want it," and went on crying. And then Susan said, "Well, I beg your pardon, and I'm sorry, and you said you would speak to me again if I said that." So Betty said, "Do you mean it?" And she said she did. And then Betty kissed her, and she kissed Betty, and they made it up. And Susan said, "I will be more careful not to take your stockings any more." And Betty said, "I don't mind if you do take them." So then they got ready for tea, and Susan helped Betty wash her face so as to look as if she hadn't been crying. But their mother knew she had. But she didn't say anything, because she said it was always best to take no notice. The end.